So when you hear the term Sharia law, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of people, it's this idea of a single, rigid book of ancient rules. But what if I told you the reality is a 1,400-year-old conversation, one that's full of debate, full of diversity, and constantly evolving? Today we're going way beyond the headlines to figure out what Sharia law really is.
All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to nail down what we're even talking about. Then we'll look at the actual tools that scholars use to figure this stuff out. After that, we'll see how disagreement became, well, a central feature of the whole tradition, how it actually played out in history, and finally, how it's still changing today. So let's jump right in.
So, what is Sharia law? To really get past all the common misunderstandings, there's one really crucial distinction we have to make right from the get-go.
So let's just challenge that core assumption right away. Is Islamic law really some monolithic, unchangeable code? Or is it something a lot more alive? More like a tradition shaped by actual human minds trying their best to grasp a divine ideal.
Okay, this slide right here, this is the absolute key to understanding this entire topic. On one side, you have Sharia. Think of it as the big idea, God's perfect, abstract, divine will. It's the path, not a literal book of laws. Then, on the other side, you've got fiqh, and that's the human part. That's the messy, brilliant, and often debated effort by scholars to understand and apply that divine path. Put it this way, Sharia is the destination, fiqh is the science of drawing the map.
The scholar Wael Halak really hits the nail on the head here. He explains why trying to compare Islamic law to something like a modern tax code just completely misses the point. It just blurs that critical difference between the divine ideal, Sharia, and the very human attempt to live it out, fiqh. They're just not the same thing.
So, if fiqh is a human process, how does it actually work? I mean, it's not just arbitrary, right? Scholars aren't just making things up. Nope, they follow a pretty clear methodology. Let's take a look inside what we might call their toolkit.
Jurists don't just pull opinions out of thin air. There's a hierarchy of sources they have to follow. First up, always, is the Quran. Then they turn to the Sunnah, the example set by the Prophet. After that, they look to see if past scholars reached a consensus on the issue. But what happens when the answer isn't obvious in any of those? Well, that's where the last and maybe the most dynamic tool comes into play.
And that brings us to this powerful concept, ijtihad. It literally means struggle or effort, and it's basically the engine of change in Islamic law. It's the formal process that allows a qualified scholar to use their own independent reasoning to tackle new problems. It's an engine for innovation that's built right into the system itself.
So think about it for a second. If you have a system that relies on human interpretation, and you have a tool that specifically encourages independent reasoning, what are you going to get? You're going to get disagreement. But here's the twist. Instead of being a problem, this diversity of opinion actually became a respected core feature of the entire tradition.
And this disagreement wasn't just chaos. It was actually organized into what are called schools of law, or madhabs. Within Sunni Islam, 4 big ones emerged. You had the Hanafi school, known for its focus on reason. The Maliki school, which was happy to bring in local customs. The Shafi, which kind of synthesized the first two. And the Hanbali, which was the most conservative, sticking very strictly to the texts. And the amazing part? They were all seen as legitimate.
And like Wael Halak says, this pluralism wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. This human attempt to understand God's will, the fiqh, was just accepted as being fundamentally diverse. The basic idea was that one divine truth could actually lead to many valid human interpretations.
And you really have to let this sink in. For the better part of 1,000 years, these different schools all existed together with a lot of mutual respect. A judge from one school would almost always recognize the rulings of another. There wasn't one single official Islamic law, but a whole ecosystem of legitimate and sometimes competing legal tradition.
Okay, so that's the theory. But what about the real world? How did all this actually play out when it came to running empires and states? Let's take a look. Check this out. This one page from an old Ottoman law book tells us so much. Look at the title, Hukuk, Sharia, va Kanun. That's law, Sharia, and Kanun, right there in black and white. This isn't just some abstract idea. It shows a very clear separation between 2 different types of law, both operating at the same time.
And for centuries, in huge empires like the Ottoman one, this meant you had parallel legal systems. On one track, you had religious judges using Sharia to handle things like family matters, inheritance, and contracts. But at the exact same time, on another track, the Sultan issued his own secular laws called Kanun to run the government, the police, and the tax system.
This history alone shows that the idea of a single Sharia law controlling everything is just a modern oversimplification.
Okay, now let's jump forward in time to the early 20th century, a moment of huge change. Old empires were collapsing, modern nation-states were rising, and Muslim societies faced this massive choice. Do we just import European legal codes wholesale, or can we modernize using our own traditions? Afghanistan gives us a really fascinating test case.
So what did they choose? Did they just copy and paste from European law books? Nope. Afghan reformers made a very conscious decision. They took their own legal tradition, their own heritage, and they used it as the raw material to build a modern state. They engaged in that same process of ijtihad we talked about, creating something new from something old.
And this brings us right up to the present day. Because that tradition of interpretation and adaptation, it didn't just stop in the 20th century. Oh no, it is still evolving and is being applied to fields that the original jurists could never, ever have imagined.
And one of the most surprising and frankly impressive modern examples is the multi-trillion-dollar industry of Islamic finance. This is a direct product of modern-day jurists using those classic tools of fiqh to create brand-new financial products. And let's be clear, this isn't some tiny niche idea. Just look at this data from Egypt, and this is way back in 1989. The Faisal Islamic Bank was already holding more in total assets and deposits than its conventional rivals. This is a major economic force, and it's all built on a distinct set of legal principles.
So how does that even work? Well, fundamentally, they take core Sharia principles, like the prohibition on charging interest, and through interpretation, they build new models. Models based on things like partnership and profit and loss sharing. It is a perfect, modern-day example of fiqh in action, creating new answers for new economic questions.
So what you have today in many Muslim-majority countries is people living in two normative worlds at once. On the one hand, they participate in a global system of international law. But at the same time, the Islamic legal tradition remains this incredibly powerful symbol and a very real source of law and identity back home. And navigating that intersection, that's one of the key challenges of our time.
So if you take one thing away from this whole explainer, let it be this. The story of Islamic law isn't the story of a static, unchanging code. It's the story of a 1,400-year-old conversation, a dynamic, living, and often heated discussion between a divine ideal and our very human reality. And that conversation is far from over, as this incredibly resilient tradition runs smack into the biggest challenges of the 21st century, everything from artificial intelligence and bioethics to evolving ideas about human rights. The crucial question remains, what's the next chapter going to look like? What will the next generation of thinkers and jurists build with that ancient toolkit of interpretation? Well, that next chapter is being written as we speak.